Morning. This is going to be a comparison video with a bunch of early Martin soprano ukuleles. Anyone who knows much about these vintage ukuleles knows that there's a very little hard information on dating, and aside from when the decal was put on versus the head stamp. But there's also not a lot of information about how the same model from different periods plays, how cracks affect playing, how koa models differ in tone, resonance, and projection from these mahogany models. So I'm just going to play a few and highlight some of the differences that illustrate why we have trouble dating these ukes. And okay, so this is a Martin 1M. It has fret markers. It has a boxwood nut and a boxwood saddle, which dates it as very early, and it has the fret markers at positions 5, 7, and 9 rather than 5, 7, and 10. On each of these ukuleles, I'm just going to play some simple chords so you can hear the differences, hopefully. Nothing particularly fancy. Okay, so this is an early Martin. It has Peghead tuners. The wooden tuners have been replaced with Pegheads. I have to say they're much easier in my mind to use than the regular wooden tuners, but you have to break one of the cardinal rules of vintage instruments, which is replace the original ones with something else. Although you can save the wooden ones. Okay, on to uke number 2. Uke number 2 is another early Martin. Once again, fret markers at positions 5, 7, and 9. I was just looking at this ukulele and I noticed some differences. The bridge on this uke is different than the bridge on my other early Martins, and although there's no sign whatsoever of it having been replaced, it is different. Another thing I noticed is that the saddle looks like it was stained and that it was light wood. So one of the ways we date early Martins is by the wood used for the nut and saddle. Ebony, I think it's ebony, came in later than the boxwood. This has a dark nut, but if you looked, you can see that the saddle looks like it has been stained, and that the wood itself is actually light. And so maybe someone more knowledgeable than me can explain that. This ukulele also has mechanical tuners, although they're period tuners. Sorry, the playing wasn't the best there. Okay. Now we will move on to another early Model 1M, this one with wooden tuners, what looks like an ebony nut, but it has a boxwood saddle. I can't remember. I'm thinking now that ebony was only used for a couple years and then mahogany was brought in, but maybe I'm wrong about that. Okay, so that's another early Martin 1M, probably pre-1922, with the fret markers at 5, 7, and 9 once again. And the last ukulele that I'm going to play is a 1K, a Koa uke, because until I bought this uke, I wondered if the Koa model sounded different than the mahogany models. And the answers I got were, well, not that different. I think there's a difference, although it's not as great as one would expect. Not really one would expect, as one would imagine. But now you'll have the material to judge for yourself. So you can see the wooden tuners here, the 5, 7, 9 fret markers, and the boxwood saddle and boxwood nut. So we know that this is an early Martin, regardless of its exact dating. Okay, so that's the 1K. All right, well now let's talk about these different ukes and hopefully give you a few surprises. Because Martin ukuleles were made with such thin wood, the vintage ukes, of course that's what gives them their great size, their great sound, they are prone to cracking. So whenever somebody buys a Martin, especially somebody inexperienced, and because these ukes are regarded as some of the best ukes ever made, you know, the question always is, I see one with a crack, should I buy it? And so of these ukes, only one was completely crack-free. This uke had a fairly substantial crack on the back, but still sounds great, you know. Obviously, the key to buying a uke that has some condition problems, or really the key to buying any uke, is to be able to play it. But of course, given that eBay, especially for vintage instruments, is perhaps the primary market today in the United States, we can't always do that. So I guess you can't really judge a crack from afar. But my point here is that a uke with a fairly substantial crack still sounds pretty good. Now, the caveat with that is that I have a friend who's an expert luthier and has built custom guitars for all sorts of names you would recognize, and he does all my uke repairs. So the key to making a uke that has a crack or has condition problems is making sure that it goes to a luthier who's an expert in uke repair or string instrument repair. So that is something to be concerned about. When I bought this uke, the crack had been repaired, but I didn't think the job was particularly good. I took it to my luthier, and it's pretty hard to tell that there's this big crack in the back. But more importantly, it actually sounds a little better. All right, let's move on to see what other unveilings need to be done. This uke, this Martin uke, the 1M with the wooden pegs, also had what I would call a medium-sized crack on the back. I bought it from an experienced player, and he assured me that it sounded good, so I trusted him, and he was honest. This uke, the 1M with the Peghead Tuners, has no cracks whatsoever. It's in perfect shape. Just a wonderful little uke. This was the second uke I played, the 1M with mechanical tuners, and this is kind of the surprise, although hopefully you'll be surprised that there weren't huge sound differences between the two other 1Ms, the one with the fairly extensive crack and the one without. Once again, expert repair makes the difference, but this uke had 8 cracks on the soundboard. I bought it for a very inexpensive price. Had to pay an inexpensive price was $380 or so, which for a uke of this vintage was a steal. Then I took it over to my buddy, the luthier, and I had to put a couple $100 more into gluing and cleaning cracks. But aside from the fact that this uke doesn't quite have the projection of the other two, if I told you beforehand this was a uke that had 8 cracks, listen to it in comparison to the one that has no cracks or the one that had 1 crack, I think you'd be shocked at how close they all sound. And I bought this because I travel a lot for business, and as a consequence, I wanted a beater uke that I could take with me and just put in my carry-on and not worry about it. I'm not a particularly experienced musician, so I wanted a uke that had basically the same fingerboard and patterns as the ukes I love to play, these other vintage Martins. So that's why I didn't buy a really cheap uke as a travel uke. Alright, well hopefully this video will have clarified some issues or questions that you may have wanted answered about Martin vintage ukes, and hopefully it'll be an interesting sound test. So I have to say that I love vintage Martin ukes. Obviously, they just have a sound and a feel that I've fallen in love with, and maybe you will too. Thank you.